Hello, everyone. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am your host. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, I'm not going to keep this video long, but I did want to touch on this since this is one of the stories I've been following. I am a sucker for international news, and so this perspective tends to kind of go all over beyond domestic politics. In this case, trade war. The United States is involved in a trade war. The two largest economies of the world are bumping uglies with one another, and the rest of the world is taking a hit for it. Look at the stock market in the United States and China. And that is not going to be isolated to those countries the longer this goes on. Now, here's the catch. Donald Trump put out in a tweet that he was increasing 10% to 25%, meaning tariffs on items coming into the country from China. Now, Trump lied or was comically stupid in not knowing that those things weren't necessarily paid by the Chinese companies, but those were paid by American companies, who in turn put those out on the American consumer. It's estimated that Americans might end up paying $800 a piece for these, meaning you, random Joe Schmo, is going to end up paying $800 more for the taxes that Donald Trump has just levied. Yes, it's on China, but yes, you're paying them. You're paying them. Those costs translates or translates. So China retaliates. China had no choice but to retaliate in somewhat of a tit-for-tat measure on this. I kind of want to have a conversation about the limits of rationality, because tit-for-tat is rational within the context of the system itself. But also language. Like, think about this for the moment. These people who are involved in this are political actors. Now, Donald Trump lies about everything, but we're supposed to believe that the United States' position on this is exactly what we're told it is by government. Meaning, what they're saying and the wording that they're using is getting across a connotation that is not necessarily true. And because it's not true, it makes you start thinking to yourself, well, what about the other side? What's the perspective of the other side? I gave that perspective of what I thought that perspective was, and I was right. I was absolutely right. Now, first point, this notion of forced technology transfers. Again, this is political language. Corporations in the United States made deals to get access to Chinese workers and access to Chinese, land resources workers, and to be able to sell their goods in the country, but also access to those workers. And what they did was they said, great, I can pay this Chinese worker less, in which case they can move their factories over there. And once the tariffs are off, maybe through trade deals like NAFTA, TPP, etc., those goods can be brought back into the country with no tariffs on them. Now understand what that means. That company has just made a deal that allows him to pay the American worker less and to undercut the items of products that are made in America in general. So if those products from China are being sold in the Walmart, those products are sold at a cheaper amount. The American product that was crowding the shelf at that point, off. And the American products that are there to try to compete with it are going to lose out because the Chinese product that's made generally just as good, much, much cheaper. There wasn't a forced technology transfer. It's my point. Those were deals that those corporations made in order to make themselves extraordinarily rich. China just has certain rules governing whether or not or what you're allowed to do in the country. Meaning, if you're going to benefit from this country, you're going to have to get something back to the country. It's no more forced. Its taxes are forced in the United States. But that's the language that they've been using. Forced technology transfers of China is ripping and stealing from the American corporation that's made billions off of the deals that they've made. This was a win-win deal if you're talking about in the context of China and those corporations, as you can cut it. Here's what changed. China's economy has gotten to the point where it's going to pass the U.S. economy, and depending on the metrics that you're using, it's passed the U.S. economy. From a geopolitical standpoint, that is problematic because large economies bring about them just by virtue of their girth, certain economic advantages and economic strength. You could say soft power in this regard. But that soft power at some point can translate to hard power when that economic might starts to get used towards weapons. Think of the United States in World War I and World War II, where the economic might of the country was turned into building bombs and boats and ships and guns and etc. And so from a business interest and from a geopolitical interest, both kind of meet dovetail in this. The catch is China is not going to give up a business model that's made it profitable. And it's a little bit weird that the capital economy of the world, you know, the uber capitalist economy of the world, is having difficulty dealing with the commies engaged in capitalism. Meaning what you're talking about is a capitalistic deal that the capitalistic country now wants to change or intervene into. And just for last point, the argument that I made in the last video was that part of negotiation is that nothing is signed until everything is signed. And the notion and the position of the United States on this is comically absurd. And the notion of the way that the media runs with it is even worse. It's a negotiation. Until everything is agreed upon, nothing is agreed upon. And running away screaming, the Chinese said that they were going to do this and reneged. And nobody in the media have I yet heard make that basic understood negotiating thing. The point is the media, in this case, is purely for the United States. You may get other Western countries that buy into this. But the reality is a little bit more nuanced. So I want you to hear from this gentleman.
Vice Premier said Beijing was still cautiously optimistic.
So this gentleman who was negotiating it, Liu He, I think his name is, was just demoted. What that means is that whatever is agreed upon now has to go to a higher authority. My hypothesis at the time was that he agreed upon things that he should not have agreed upon. And when he went back to get this approved, they told him no. That's, in which case he was he was demoted. That's my thought. I haven't necessarily heard news on that yet because the Chinese position in this is not necessarily fully being explored in Western media. But let's hear him talk about this. And he is literally going to say the same thing I think I did last week about this.
I don't think the negotiation has broken down. On the contrary, I think it is just a small setback in the talks between the two countries, which is inevitable. We are still cautiously optimistic for the future. The U.S. side said we had promised something in the documents and we wanted to change it. We believe that before the two sides reach a deal, any change is normal. It is something that happens in the process. So I don't think China stepped back, and we don't agree with the word renege.
Well, Scotty,
Yeah, I agree with him on this. I don't think he's insane. I'm sorry. I don't think that's an insane position. Now, understand, everything that is taking place here is negotiation. All of it. The media, in this case, is an aspect of negotiation. When Donald Trump comes out and throws a tantrum saying, oh my God, I'm increasing tariffs to 25%. That's the Nixon crazy man theory. I want them to think Nixon is insane, that Nixon would do anything. That's how we get to an agreement. China's point in this is uber rational. Look, until everything is agreed upon, nothing is agreed upon. I don't think that's an insane proposition. Nevertheless, this is going forward. These guys are apparently still talking to one another. But up until this point, this is where this is. China is retaliating on, I think, 60% of the goods. $60 million, I believe. Yeah, $60 billion of goods. Here's the catch. The amount that China imports from the United States is not as much. However, it is somewhat targeted, meaning the 60 billion that China is hitting the United States with is hitting Trump voters. Well, let's not say Trump voters, hitting areas that Trump need in order to win the election. This just so happens to be a farm area, and in farm areas just so happens to be people who import a lot to China. They are feeling the burn on this issue. Pun not intended. Farmers are getting hit by this. And those are in areas of Trump voters. So Trump has come out saying that he's going to have some kind of rescue package for the farmers who are taking the brunt of what China is doing. Now, the only reason Trump is doing this is because those people vote. And in a year and a half, if this thing still drags on for that long, markets are going to get demolished. Well, they're already getting demolished. At some point, it's going to account for what is taking place and find equilibrium. Ideally, we don't necessarily know that. I mean, this is two major countries. The United States was a certain degree of hubris and China is somewhat the turn of the worm, not taking any shit off of the United States, nor should they. A secondary question: is it right for the United States to try to curtail the growth of China? Now, understand if you say, well, look, this has nothing to do with right and wrong. This is the issue of politics and power. And in the sense of power, one power does try to curtail the strength of another power because it doesn't want it to get to the point of surpassing it. That's not necessarily an issue of right or wrong. That's an issue of power and dominance. Fair enough. Let's just own that, though. Like, let's get away from this notion that this is somehow right and wrong. This is one country trying to curtail the growth of another country. That's literally what it is. And the media being somewhat compliant in this. This is also the secondary country not necessarily wanting to accept a change of terms that would find it in a diminutive status, if that makes sense. China is investing heavily in infrastructures, investing heavily in medical, solar power, all of these industries, AI, that the United States should also be dumping trillions of dollars into instead of spending all of that money going around and killing and subjecting, let's say, tyranny upon the world to a certain degree. Let's say imperialistic pursuits. Let's make it nice. But you get my point. One country is investing a ton of money in these areas. The other country is not. And the country that is not, that is dominated predominantly by military, I mean, we spend over $1 trillion in military, is now trying to curtail the other country that is, with its Western lackeys being on board for this. Does the U.S. have a right to do this? This gets a little dicey. The last point, tit for tat. If you tell me that this is an issue of power, fair enough, but most people aren't coding it in this language of power, that the United States just want to keep dominance. They're coding it in this language of some kind of trade deal stuff. This is an issue of economic dominance. And one country wanted to maintain a certain supremacy and hegemony in this area. The last point, tit for tat, and the limits of rationality. It is perfectly rational for one country that has been dominant to try to not allow another country to take power. Understood. If your goal in this, if the only goal in this, is to maintain a preeminent position. It is also uber rational for the secondary country that wants to grow and expand and find that they are in no way of lesser quality of stock. There's no cosmic god that has appointed the other person in charge to want to expand and grow. Why wouldn't they? If the same thing was bestowed upon the first country, why not the second country? So it makes all the sense in the world from the strategies of the people that are involved in the conflict to engage in a certain tit for tat. You hit my dog, I kill your cat, and you move on from there. That's essentially what we're seeing taking place. The problem with tit for tat is, where does this go? If in tit for tat scenarios, if people continue with it, then it goes on in perpetuity until the system dissolves and destroys itself. If people do great, then no issue. Meaning if I don't hit you, nobody gets hit. By the same token, if you hit me, we all die in a pool of blood. We're engaged in an economic tit for tat with one person who was perfectly okay with shutting the government down for a campaign pledge, and another country that seems to be a little bit more rational in the way that they go about their affairs, because to some degree they have to be, because they're dealing with a far more dangerous opponent. I have no idea where this goes. And I would even wager that the people who are involved in it have no idea where this goes. If what starts off as economic gets somewhat of a darker tint to it. Also, understand the affairs of your country at this point. The United States is now trying to provocate a war in Iran. I don't care what Donald Trump says. He put John Bolton as the head of that. And John Bolton has intentions of his own that may be separate and distinct from what the President of the United States has tasked him to do. That's one potential military confrontation. Venezuela, that Donald Trump joked himself that Bolton was trying to get him embroiled into a complication in Venezuela. But trying to foment a coup in both countries, and at the very least, seeming to be openly threatening hostilities. Well, both, really, but specifically in the direction of Iran today. You've had 3 years where one of the major parties has demonized the second nuclear power on this planet, Russia. And this doesn't even touch the killings and assassinations that take place with kill squads in the various countries. We call them military, but call it what it is. these guys are going out and killing people in these kind of short, small raids. So I guess my point is this. Look at what your country is doing around the world. And this is now taking on kind of an economic sphere of dominance also. At what point does the rest of the world say, check, please? Europe has told Bolton to kick rocks when Bolton went over there looking for support in regards to Iran. They're standing by Iran in this, which makes any attempt at taking down Iran with zero support. You thought Iraq was unilateral. This will be unilateral in the strictest sense of the word. You may have the size. I don't count them. But nevertheless, I'll end this here. My point is this. I have no idea where this goes. I would have wagered that the people involved have no idea where this goes. We have no idea how even long this goes. We don't even know if China continues to deal with this kind of trade war in these terms. Meaning there may be other things that they could do that we haven't necessarily thought of that tweaks our dependent markets. Whatever it is, Trump has to be very careful with this going into the election, because the people who are going to be hurt the most by this may be his voters. So I'll end this here because, again, I didn't want this one to go too long. If you guys enjoy the content, please consider sharing, liking, subscribing. You can always support the PayPal or Patreon. Thanks all.